Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, dear colleagues, dear students, dear friends of the BAA. On behalf of the Bavarian American Academy, it is our great pleasure to welcome you to the amerikahaus Munich, here to our 2026 annual conference, Free Speech, Promises, Meanings, Controversies. We're delighted that so many of you have actually joined us here from universities and other research institutions, from journalism, education, cultural organizations, and civil society from across Germany, Europe, and North America. This year's conference takes place at a significant historical moment. Less than a week ago, the United States celebrated the 250th anniversary, 2026 anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But as we can clearly see from the bitter controversies around this year's 4th of July in the United States, such anniversaries are not only inviting celebration, but also critical reflection about what democratic ideals have meant in the past, how such meanings were tested and contested, and how meanings might have been redefined over time. And just one reminder of, for instance, Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech that you're all familiar with. This anniversary thus compels us to ask about the challenges to democratic ideals and practices in the present and what they might imply for the future. One of the central issues in this context is the question of free speech. That's why we're here. While free speech, as the Constitution's First Amendment, is not part of the Declaration of Independence, it forms the bedrock of a liberal understanding of democracy, and it is arguably at the heart of many contemporary controversies, whether they concern the banning of books, executive orders, the establishment of speech codes, questions of how to deal with hate speech on and offline, or how to safeguard the freedom of the press. Therefore, the title of our conference invites such critical reflection by combining three words: promises, meanings, controversies. The promise of free speech is one of democratic participation, but what exactly does that mean, and for whom? For its meaning has never been fixed, but has continuously evolved across different historical moments and social struggles. Which challenges do conflicting notions of free speech present for modern democracies? After all, its controversies reveal that democracy itself is not a finished achievement, not a finished project, but an ongoing process of negotiation and, as we can see only too clearly, increasingly of safeguarding. Therefore, the central premise of this conference is that free speech cannot be understood merely as a legal doctrine contained within a constitutional text. It is also a cultural practice and a historical process, and it imposes ethical responsibilities. It requires institutions willing to protect dissent and citizens prepared to listen across differences. But it also requires scholars committed to rigorous inquiry, even or especially when conversations become uncomfortable. The Bavarian American Academy was founded to foster precisely these kinds of transatlantic conversations. At times when democratic values are increasingly challenged on both sides of the Atlantic, opportunities for a respectful interdisciplinary dialogue are more important than ever. We have tried to reflect this not only in the thematic range of our conference, and Carsten Fitz will say a little bit more about that in a moment, but also in a structure that seeks to initiate dialogue by foregrounding formats such as counter-dialogue, roundtables, and panel response structures. Before I hand over to Carsten Fitz, and on behalf of the BAA members on board, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to those institutions that are generously funding this event. The Stiftung Melior, the German Research Foundation, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, or rather its Bavarian branch, the Thomas Dehler Foundation, and a particular welcome to those fellows of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation who are present here today. That said, also a heartfelt thank you to our partners at the amerikahaus, Particularly heartfelt, of course, to our organizing team, Christoph Straub and Jasmin Falk in particular, and everyone here who helps with technology, etc., and the buffet. But also to you as speakers, panelists, respondents, moderators, and all of you who bring your expertise and your willingness to engage in meaningful discussions to this forum and to our discussions over the next couple of days. So thank you once again and welcome, and I hand over to Carsten.
A heartfelt welcome to all of you here from my side as well. Thank you, Katja, for these opening words. Few principles have occupied a more prominent place in American political culture than free speech. Enshrined in the First Amendment, freedom of expression has long been regarded as one of the defining characteristics of American democracy. It has inspired movements for political participation, social justice, and civil rights. At the same time, it has also been invoked to defend exclusion, discrimination, and political extremism. Throughout American history, free speech has never been saddled, as Katja pointed out, or uncontested as a principle. Rather, it has continually been negotiated, challenged, and redefined. Indeed, the history of free speech is also a history of competing understandings of liberty itself. More than a century ago, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., reflecting on the importance of intellectual pluralism, famously observed that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. Now, whether one embraces or questions the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas, it has profoundly shaped American constitutional thought and continues to influence contemporary debates about expression in contemporary societies. Yet history also reminds us that the promise of free speech has never been equally available to all. As Frederick Douglass pointed out, liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. For Douglass, freedom of speech was not an abstract constitutional privilege, but the indispensable condition for human dignity and democratic participation. His words remind us that the struggle for free expression has always been inseparable from broader struggles over citizenship, equality, and justice. The same conviction resonates in the words of Justice Louis Brandeis, who argued that those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties. Brandeis understood free speech not simply as protection against government interference, but as a prerequisite for democratic self-government, one that depends upon informed citizens willing to engage one another through reason rather than fear. At the same time, our own age confronts us with questions the framers of the Constitution could scarcely have had in mind. Digital platforms, algorithmic amplification, artificial intelligence, and the global circulation of misinformation challenge long-held assumption about who speaks, who listens, and who exercises power over public discourse. In this context, the words often attributed to George Orwell acquire renewed significance. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Whether in 18th century pamphlets or 21st century digital networks, democracy continues to depend upon the willingness to protect uncomfortable speech while also cultivating the civic virtues that make meaningful dialogue possible in the first place. Today, these questions have acquired renewed urgency across the United States and indeed across many democratic societies. We are witnessing growing polarization, the spread of digital disinformation, declining trust in democratic institutions, increasing pressures on journalists and universities, and fierce public disputes over the boundaries of acceptable expression. Debates surrounding campus speech, social media platforms, hate speech, artificial intelligence, and censorship have demonstrated that disagreements about free speech are ultimately disagreements about democracy itself. Who has the right to speak? Who is actually heard? Who decides which voices belong in the public sphere? And perhaps most importantly, what responsibilities accompany the freedom to speak? These are not exclusively American questions. They concern all democratic societies seeking to balance liberty with equality, individual rights with collective responsibilities, and open debate with the protection of human dignity. American studies has always been uniquely positioned to address such questions because it is inherently interdisciplinary. Constitutional law, history, political theory, literature, cultural studies, media studies, philosophy, journalism, and education all illuminate different dimensions of public discourse. Only by bringing these perspectives together can we begin to appreciate the complexity of what we casually refer to as free speech. It is therefore especially fitting that this conference brings together scholars from a wide range of disciplines alongside journalists, educators, and representatives of cultural institutions. The conversations over the coming 3 days are intended not merely to analyze contemporary controversies, but to historicize them, to contextualize them, and perhaps even to challenge some of our own assumptions. Our program precisely reflects this ambition. This afternoon, we will begin with an original dialogue written specifically for this conference by Vanessa Vollmann. Drawing inspiration from Plato's Phaedrus, her dialogue asks us to reconsider the relationship between the freedom to speak and the freedom of speech itself through race-conscious and intersectional perspectives. This creative intervention reminds us that scholarly inquiry may itself take multiple forms. The dialogue will then lead directly into our opening podium discussion, Free Speech in Jeopardy. We're deeply honored to welcome an exceptional panel whose expertise spans history, journalism, public memory, and constitutional questions. Together, they will examine how free speech is experienced, defended, contested, and sometimes threatened within contemporary democratic societies. Over the next 2 days, our discussions will continue through 3 thematic panels that revisit the historical evolution of the First Amendment, explore representations of free speech in American literature and visual culture, and investigate contemporary conflicts surrounding public discourse in classrooms, on university campuses, online, and in broader political culture. Our conference also includes a public screening of Kim Snyder's documentary The Librarians, followed by a discussion in cooperation with the Hochschule für Film und Fernsehen München. Few issues illustrate current free speech debates more vividly than the growing number of book bans and challenges in American schools and public libraries. The documentary reminds us that constitutional principles ultimately become meaningful through the everyday work of citizens who choose to defend them. We are particularly privileged to welcome 2 internationally distinguished keynote speakers who will, of course, be separately introduced, but let me say that much. Professor David Blight of Yale University, one of the world's leading historians of slavery, emancipation, and Civil War memory, will demonstrate how struggles over whose voices are remembered, authorized, and legitimized have shaped American democracy from its beginnings to the present day. At a moment when academic freedom itself has become the subject of political contestation, Professor Blight also reminds us of the public responsibility of scholarship, that is, which most of us have in our function as scholars. Our second keynote speaker, Jacob Mchanga of Vanderbilt University, has become one of the leading international voices of freedom of expression and human rights. His historical work traces the development of free speech from classical antiquity to today's digital age, while his newest research addresses the challenges posed by social media, artificial intelligence, and the global decline of democratic freedoms. his keynote will invite us to think not only about how free speech has evolved, but also about how it might be defended in the decades ahead of us. I wish all of us an inspiring conference, stimulating conversations, new collaborations, and perhaps even a renewed appreciation of why free speech remains both one of democracy's greatest promises and one of its most enduring controversies. Thank you very much, and please welcome here, and let's open this conference of the Bavarian American Academy 2026.
It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Vanessa Vollmann, who will open with a counter-dialogue, indeed. Let me just very briefly introduce her. Vanessa Vollmann is a translator and interpreter and who holds a doctorate in American Studies and a master's degree in International Relations and English Studies. She teaches literary and cultural studies at the University of Passau, and her research and teaching focuses on analyzing power structures and on examining how social narratives emerge and are suppressed at the intersection of race, class, gender, and history. Now, among the cultural scripts and movements that she currently investigates are, for instance, the Broadway musical Hamilton or the politicization of Taylor Swift and Beyoncé's art. She also facilitates workshops on racism and sexism in everyday situations, and her public talks are crafted along the format of critical race theory counter-dialogues, and Carsten just mentioned that, which is also what we will start with. So please join me in welcoming Vanessa Vollmann.
It says password.
Start.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your kind introduction. Thank you, above all, for the privilege of giving the first talk at this so pertinent conference on the situation of freedom of speech in these trying times. And thank you also to the organizers for putting the conference together. Today, I would like to offer some thoughts on the relationality between the right of freedom of speech, secured in the First Amendment 235 years ago, and the freedom to speak on one's own behalf at all in the years since. And to throw another figure out there, I will do so in a format that is 2,396 years old. Plato's Socrates-Phaedrus dialogue sees two individuals taking a walk and cooling their feet in a stream while discussing the topic of love. It was written 370 BCE, and it is the blueprint I'm adopting for the dialogue I've written for today. While the First Amendment was an astonishing idea at its conception, it was not yet ideal at the time it was added to the Constitution, because, as we know, it actually did not extend the rights covered in the amendment to all members of society. And this is also because most of the founding fathers, the obvious exception being John Adams, were enslavers. They owned people and exploited their labor. This contradiction in the amendment, as opposed to the ideal, was one that was due a correction, of course, so that the freedom of speech actually first needed to provide the freedom to speak for oneself to non-landowning white men, white women, all people of color, black people, enslaved, and indigenous people. This is why, to my mind, a specifically critical race theory dialogue seems a good fit. Critical race theory is a concept with roots in critical theory, so in Germany of the 1930s, which critically examined society and its power structures in order to uncover mechanisms of oppression and social control. Also known as the Frankfurt School, it was founded by Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse. In the 1980s, this theory was expanded to include the study of racism within those structures, and this is known as critical race theory. And as we know, critical thinking and scholarship has been a thorn in the side of the current administration, and critical race theory in particular has come under attack. In 2020, Aya Martinez expanded the original 6 tenets of critical race theory from the 1980s and proposed to use critical race theory both as a methodology and as a method. As a methodology, she posits that additional tenets are needed. These are 1, accessibility, and 2, experiential knowledge. Accessibility expresses the need to take critical thinking out of the academic ivory tower, to make the language more accessible, to include more people who are systemically affected and more people who are oblivious to systemic structures of domination because they might belong to a privileged and advantaged group and might not even be aware of it. With experiential knowledge, she means that it is important, when the experience of racism is addressed, that this space should also be created by people of color who live the racism experience rather than only about people of color. The method she does this with is counterstory. Her counterstories are creative dialogues, which she bases on Plato's Phaedrus-Socrates mentor-mentee dialogue structure. And in them, composite characters speak to one another and unpack complex topics in an accessible format. In the creative dialogue that you're about to hear, one of the composite characters is Bridget, a German woman of color who teaches American studies at the University of Passau, and the other is Nathan, a fictional white American visiting scholar, a man. Bridget has engaged in such dialogues before. This dialogue takes place in 2 parts. Today, they are walking from the Munich Central Station to the Bavarian American Academy venue at the amerikahaus to join the conference on free speech. It's a 15-minute walk, and they're happy to get a little footwork in after having been on the train from Passau for the past 2 hours. 4 hours. Thank you. The stage is set. Part 1. Not everything in history is about race and gender. Nathan says, this is one exciting World Cup. Germany is out, and the US team lost despite Trump getting involved and calling on Infantino to revoke the suspension of a red-carded player. I still can't believe that happened. She nods. Well, a World Cup is nothing if it's not surprising. But yes, if that is why the suspension was revoked, then it's just downright wrong. Listen, some of us are going to see the game tonight at a beer garden. Care to join? She holds him back from crossing the street. Hold on, Nathan. We need to take a left here to get to the Karolinenplatz. Careful of the tram. The crossing tram gives off a signal-jingling noise, and when it passes, they cross the road. He picks up the conversation and says enthusiastically, "Count me in for the game tonight, Bridget." And then he pauses thoughtfully before turning to her and adding, "And also, I'm glad that we have a moment together before the conference, because there is something I wanted to ask you about, and I completely forgot to do so on the train. And it's a little awkward, and I've been looking for the right moment." She raises her eyebrows. "Okay, that sounds ominous. Is something the matter?" He frowns and is obviously uncomfortable when he says, "It's just a question I have regarding your lesson that I visited yesterday at Uni Passau, and it's a bit about your intersectional take on historical facts." "I see. Well, why don't you just go ahead and ask it then, Nathan? We've been friends forever, and it wouldn't be the first time we disagree. I know you often consider me too woke, and I know that you struggle with the concept of intersectionality. Now, if I remember correctly, in the class you visited, the context was the American Revolution that then led to the Declaration of Independence, and after the war, to the Constitution and the amendments. We were specifically discussing the First Amendment, which protects 5 fundamental freedoms: the freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and the right to petition the government." "Yes, that's right," says Nathan. "So I was excited to learn more about the societal dynamics in the run-up to all that." "You mean how the spirit of 1776 was not something that just happened, and the colonies rose up as a monolith against the British when they'd had enough?" She pauses and looks at him. "Can I just say, I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion at this conference." "Me too," says Nathan, and pulls out his phone to take a look at the program. So many different perspectives we'll be hearing in the next few days. He reads, just in the opening panel, we'll have a legal perspective on the First Amendment by someone who teaches it, Professor Stephen D. Solomon from NYU. I've nearly finished his book, Revolutionary Dissent, How the Founding Generation Created the Freedom of Speech, an absolute must-read. Then we have a political science perspective from Professor Dr. Gerlinde Groitl from the University of Passau, who's also the head of the ISS Institute for Security and Strategy. For the journalistic perspective, we will be hearing from Reymer Klüver from the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and then we're also so lucky to hear from Professor Mirjam Zadoff, who's a historian and the director of the Munich Documentation for the History of National Socialism. Yes, exclaims Bridget enthusiastically, what a fantastic lineup. She pauses before she asks, where were we, Nathan? You had a question for me. Yes, the spirit of 1776, he says, getting back to the conversation. So, as you discussed with your students in class, there was the Stamp Act in 1765. This was a decade before the Declaration of Independence and 2 decades before the Bill of Rights, so when the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were ratified. In my understanding, the colonials were just furious about this first direct tax from the British government. And then the so-called Boston Massacre happened, and Crispus Attucks was killed in the heat of the moment. And when the British started taxing the tea a few years later, enough was enough, and everything went downhill from there, for the British at least. So where's your question, Nathan? Asked Bridget. He takes a deep breath and continues, well, in that context, I of course understand why you needed to speak about intersectionality and systemic racism, because Crispus Attucks was, after all, a person of color and the first man to die in the revolutionary moment. He pauses and drops his voice a notch before adding tentatively, I just think that sometimes you make everything about race and gender. He takes a step back and looks a little unsure of himself while Bridget pulls up her eyebrows. They've stopped walking and are standing across from each other on the pavement. He continues, there, I've said it. Don't freak out, Bridget. I just don't understand why. In every discussion about historical events, we need to include a discussion about structural racism and sexism. It just makes things so complicated. In your class, for instance, we were talking about the Stamp Act. We know that this act affected primarily middle-class professionals, people who worked with paper like lawyers and printers. And we also know that these professionals were predominantly white and male. So why do we need to talk about race when we're talking about this act? Is it not possible to talk objectively and neutrally about historical events anymore, instead of always making things intersectional? It just feels so constructed sometimes. You can't seriously be mad at me for asking this, Bridget. I'm just expressing my honest and well-meaning opinion. Maybe think about it? She sighs. Okay, give me a second to sort my thoughts here. Let me just ignore your assumption that when I talk about intersectional structural racism in a discussion, this makes a discussion less objective. Oh, no, sorry, that's not what I meant to say, says Nathan. I think you might be misunderstanding me. Actually, Nathan, I think I didn't misunderstand anything because you were quite clear. He looks uncomfortable. Bridget asks, can I make a suggestion? And when he nods, she continues, let's drop the notion of misunderstandings, objectivity, neutrality, and assumptions, and stick to the facts when we're talking about historical events, all right? Yes, please, says Nathan, breathing out. Okay, then, says Bridget, let me address gender first. 50% of the world's population is female, and that was so in the 1770s in the US. So, isn't the real question, why is everything not also about gender? Everything, even the Stamp Act, affected women too. It was just a series of different effects than the ones you addressed. It is these effects that are often overlooked in historical storytelling. But isn't that the real gap in historical storytelling? Needn't we include everybody to make a discourse more effective? I really don't understand how that makes an investigation less objective, only more complete. Fair point, nods Nathan. I've never really thought about it that way. He ponders this for a moment. Then his eyes widen as something else occurs to him. His tone is challenging once again. Still, he says, surely you'll agree with me that it's become quite difficult for someone like me to get the wording straight in these matters. So when it's about race or gender or queerness or whatever. In the current atmosphere, people are feeling more like no one is allowed to say anything anymore, because you might just get canceled. Oh, stop being so melodramatic, Nathan. You can say whatever you want. No one's stopping you. It's just that in this atmosphere, as you just called it, someone like me will also say something, and you just might not like the answer. I think that might be the discomfort you're feeling. He tips his head forward thoughtfully and smiles self-consciously. You might be onto something there. And then he says much more agreeably, so what you're saying is that when we are exploring historical events, we need to take more of the context into account? Yes, Exactly, exclaims Bridget. It's what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the danger of a single story. Through an intersectional lens, when we're investigating the context of the pre-revolutionary lead-up, we could take a closer look at the Sugar and Molasses Act, which was issued by the British government a year before the Stamp Act. Okay, says Nathan, you're going to have to fill me in on that one. Yes, sure, says Bridget accommodatingly. So the so-called American Indian Wars were still ongoing when the so-called settlers spread and expanded their territory brutally, breaking treaties, etc. The global context was the 7 Years' War, which the British miraculously won against the French. This was happening on 3 different continents, in Europe, the Americas, the Philippines, West Africa, and India. But let's stick to the Americas. Just imagine how empty the British coffers were after all this war. But now they had also gained a large amount of land in the Americas, and this new, very long border needed to be protected. And the British were paying to protect this border with money and manpower. Nathan nods. I think I know where you're going with this, Bridget. This is where the British, who were actually protecting the settlers, who were still British after all, turn out to have different objectives than the settlers, the colonists, who want to expand. The British don't want the colonies to expand. On point, Nathan. British interests align with Native American interests often on this topic at this time. And when they do, they don't align with the colonists' interests. For example, the British recognized the Haudenosaunee as a sovereign state in a time when many voices in the colonies, among them voices of founding fathers, were calling Native Americans, and I quote, savages. So while the colonists were justifying their brutal and violent capture of the land, they were dehumanizing the people who had been there all along. How can we not talk about intersectional and structural racism here? And also, if you'll allow me to remind you, it's not all I talk about in this context, but it has a rightful place in that discourse, in my opinion. Such a position on historical storytelling is just not something that is deemed patriotic by the current administration. Now, hold on just a second, Bridget. You're making it, hold on a second. Mixed up. Such a position on historical storytelling is just not something that is deemed patriotic by the current administration. Now hold on just a second, Bridget. Now you're making me sound like some kind of a racist or something. I never said anything about not supporting the teaching of indigenous or black histories. I just meant that, oh, I see, I'm the one who challenged you. He's quiet for a moment and looks at her. That's the real encroachment, right? Denying Americans who tell a different story than the founding myth the right to tell their histories, closing down museums, getting rid of DEI. That's the real encroachment of the freedom to speak your ancestors' stories, to speak other American histories. She nods. And I think that's one of the core issues here in the fight for freedom to speak, actually. Just because minorities and marginalized groups have been shut up for so long, their voices now trigger people in positions of power. It looks to me a lot like the ongoing discussion is not about rights at all, but about retaining power. He nods in agreement. True. And you know, when you just mentioned the Sugar and Molasses Act, it made me think of Toussaint Louverture. I just finished a biography about him. He was the general who led the first successful revolt of enslaved people. He was born an enslaved man in Saint-Domingue, what we now call Haiti. At the time, Saint-Domingue was the richest French colony in the Americas. Bridget nods. Well, actually, that revolution was a little later during the French Revolutionary era and before Napoleon. But the British Sugar and Molasses Act is connected to Saint-Domingue because it was a protectionist measure, not a tax imposed on the American colonies like the Stamp Act. The Sugar and Molasses Act was a policy intended to ensure that sugar was bought only from British colonies, not the French colonies. And that is when we need to think about who was producing the sugar that was being protected to be traded. Both the British and the French were enslaving Africans and people of African descent. Her voice trails off. He picks up from her and says, so when we put the 18th century American fight for freedom into the global context, it leads us straight to considering the people who were literally not considered worthy of freedom at all. That's where Frederick Douglass fits into all this, right, Bridget? Yes, exactly. When we speak about the Revolutionary War and freedoms it brought to the American people, we need to remind ourselves over and over again that it took another 100 years for black men to be considered worthy of these freedoms and rights in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and then another 50 for white women, and then nearly another 50 for black women and Native women to have, at least on paper, full access to these very rights and freedoms. Part 2 of UFC fights and the World Cup. We need to take a right here, says Bridget, and points to the obelisk house is another 3 minutes tops. Where were we? Frederick Douglass, says Nathan. You know, the life achievements of that man have always just stunned me, and that includes a gender perspective. He winks at Bridget, because in all his civil rights endeavors, he always worked closely with the women's rights movement. She frowns and says a little sheepishly, I know I'm running the risk of sounding like Miss Smarty Pants here, but I think you mean the white women's rights movement and Frederick Douglass? Let's not forget that women like Susan B. Anthony did not consider black women like Sojourner Truth to be women at all, at least not in the sense that securing their rights should be included in the women's rights movement. So in the discourse of the history of attaining the freedom to speak, one option is to follow the fight of black women who were either underrepresented or not considered in both the early feminist movements and the early civil rights movements. And from there, we can draw a direct line to activists like Angela Davis, of course to writers like Toni Morrison, and public figures like Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama, exclaims Nathan. Angela Davis, I get. Toni Morrison, yeah, but the First Lady? Did you not hear about how one of the UFC fighters in that construction in front of the White House in the celebration of the president's 80th birthday screamed into Joe Rogan's microphone, and I quote, Michelle Obama is a man, am I right, America? End quote. He cringes. No, actually, I had not heard about that. He shakes his head. Well, actually, why didn't I hear about that? I mean, in any other time in American history, a public figure degrading a former first lady on the lawn of the People's House, broadcast on Paramount Plus, applauded by a sitting president, why was it not front and center in the news cycle? That's the new freedom of speech? Strong point, Nathan. And it speaks exactly to something I've been observing more and more in the public reaction to the increasingly conservative, right-wing, and at times fascist shifts in both our societies. I mean, whose dignity is protected by public opinion? Who is considered worthy of our empathy? I heard a really compelling talk about that a few weeks ago. The context was not free speech, but the visuals around immigration. In our societies, the privilege of being awarded empathy is often connected to whether the affected people are read as white. The pictures are humanizing when the migrant mothers are white, and often group-focused and at times even dehumanizing when it's about brown bodies, black and brown women. Just my 2 cents. He looks surprised. I've never noticed that, goodness. He pauses for a moment before continuing, but when you just mentioned Angela Davis, I thought to myself, of course, especially when we're thinking more transnationally, right? I mean, yes, we are immediately reminded of her activism, the Black Power movement and her imprisonment and all that, but I had to immediately think about Herbert Marcuse, her dissertation advisor. I read somewhere that the two actually became good friends. Bridget nods. Yes, that is a very interesting connection between the black feminist struggle and the Frankfurt School of Critical Thought. And of course, that leads straight to another critical theory scholar, the late Jürgen Habermas, who reminded us always that the freedoms that we've been gifted in this long era of peace in the European Union must be vigilantly defended and will not uphold themselves, that we must be constantly wary of the ongoing attacks on our freedom. Nathan nods. Yes, and in the US, it's taken on this crazy dimension, book banning. You mentioned Toni Morrison. I mean, her books have been on the banned books list in the US for decades, but this new expansion of the bans in so many states, it feels like there's a very organized element to it. She purses her lips and adds, yeah, and I think that the distance between banning books and burning books is not really that significant. And it's not just books that are under fire, am I right? I mean, we're looking at the strangest distortion of the freedoms of the press I can think of at the moment. We have an administration in the US that looks to Europe, specifically to Germany, and criticizes our system for limiting freedom of speech when we can see the active deconstruction of the American press's access to information, right? Yeah, so true, says Nathan. It feels like a very twisted and toxic interpretation of the freedom to speak, when the current US administration admonishes your government for trying to curtail the speech and actions of openly anti-democratic parties, so effectively supporting right-wing, racist, anti-immigrant, anti-women, anti-trans, anti-queer political movements while invoking the term freedom of speech. Very true, Nathan. Oh, look, we've arrived. They're standing outside the Amerika-haus. Allow me a final comment on the German-American relations, Nathan. When we are discussing the topic of racism in Germany, it's not against the same backdrop as in the US, is it? Look down the road. That's the Munich Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism. That's our history. Yes, we also have a horrific legacy of colonialism in Africa. And yet we don't have the same black-white dichotomy as in the US that goes back to 250 years of government-sanctioned systemic slavery that was followed by Jim Crow legislation. Our more recent history, especially when we think of book burnings, leads us directly to National Socialism. And then, of course, also in the current discourse to anti-immigrant leanings that are gaining so much traction so fast. It's just terrifying. Racism, of course, but with a different angle. He nods and waits a moment before he asks tentatively, so, Bridget, on what is going on in the US at the moment, does this mean you are, or you are specifically not, drawing a parallel between right-wing movements in Europe and the infringements on First Amendment rights in the US? Well, says Bridget, maybe the World Cup in the US under this administration can point us in the direction of an answer to that huge question. I can't help but think about the political and structural parallels to the Berlin Olympics in 1936 under Hitler. The world came to pay him homage, and this was at a time when he had already told the world about his plans. Why did we come? Should we be boycotting this World Cup? Is that the lesson we should be learning here? History will let us know. For now, let's go and join the conference. The curtain falls, the end. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for that input, which leads us right into the opening panel discussion of this conference on free speech. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you as the moderator of this opening panel. My name is Gerlinde Groitl. On stage, a terrific panel of experts from various walks of life with very different angles approaching the topic of free speech, and I'm sure we will have an in-depth and a wide-ranging discussion about the matter at hand. I will not give you a lengthy introduction of our speakers. You all have your conference booklets. I just want to point out that we have, as Vanessa, you already mentioned, a disciplinary diversity here on stage that is really beautiful. I welcome Stephen D. Solomon. He teaches First Amendment law at the New York University School of Institute of Journalism. I welcome Reymer Klüver from the Süddeutsche Zeitung. He's a journalist with certainly in-depth perspectives on the challenges for free speech in Germany at this point. And he also had a previous engagement as a correspondent in Washington, D.C. for the Süddeutsche Zeitung. I welcome Mirjam Zadoff from the Documentation Center on the History of National Socialism. She's a historian bringing in that perspective to our panel. And with Vanessa Vollmann, we have the American Studies angle with a focus on literary and cultural studies. So a phenomenal, terrific panel. And I would like to give each of our panelists the opportunity to bring in their unique angle on this topic, respond to elements that were to parts of what Vanessa said in her counter dialogue. And I would like to start with you, Stephen, and your viewpoint from a legal, scholarly perspective on First Amendment rights.
Thank you very much. Is this, everybody can hear this?
Yes,
oh, good.
Perfect.
Thank you. 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence We don't have to wait for 1791 to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the birth of freedom of speech and press. 1776, a month before the Declaration, the Virginia Convention declared freedom of the press as a constitutional right, the first time in human history. One of the things that's significant about that is that among all the rights that were listed, and this includes later on other states that also promulgated their own bills of rights, is freedom of the press was the only right that was listed with a reason. The reason was it was described as a bulwark of liberty. That's in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It was copied by other states. And we talk about the marketplace of ideas as a kind of an Enlightenment idea. But one of the American contributions, I think, from the founding period is the idea that the press and speech in general serves a function of checking government power. That's what a bulwark of liberty is. And followed by the Declaration of Independence, listing all the grievances against the tyranny of George III, the Virginia Declaration, as listing freedom of the press as a bulwark of liberty, is a remedy for tyranny. Now, if you go forward 15 years to 1791 and the First Amendment, it's a list of 5 rights, and they're not rights that are just put in there randomly. It's really important that in terms of the development of thought during the Revolutionary period, that the 5 rights that were protected in the First Amendment actually told and continue to tell a narrative of democracy. So let's kind of revisit that for a second. The first 2 rights protected: no establishment of religion, protecting the free exercise of religion. To the founders, the rights of conscience were so important for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was that a lot of ideas came from kind of meditating and finding your place in the world and having these ideas within yourself. And those were literally the first 2 rights protected in the First Amendment. Then the third right that's protected is the freedom of speech. And so once you develop those inner thoughts, you move outside of yourself and you engage other people. And there's a community, we hope, that is willing to listen and engage. So you have this community, you speak under liberty trees in a public square, in taverns, over dinner tables. But that doesn't really get to the problem of checking government power. And so the next right that's protected is freedom of the press. And in order to get your ideas out there to a larger audience, you need an institutional means and the protection of the institution in order to do that. And so the press operates as a way to get ideas out to a broader audience. For what purpose? Well, to come together eventually with like-minded people and assemble peaceably in the streets. And that's the fourth right that's protected. For what purpose do you assemble? To petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so the entire arc or narrative of the First Amendment is there to tell a kind of a story of democracy. And so freedom of speech and freedom of the press sit right in the center of that narrative. If you diminish substantially either one or both, you are going to affect the end of the process, which is petitioning the government for changes, checking against tyranny, the excesses of government power. And so that's one of the constitutional reasons why it is so important to be vigilant about those protections. Now, as you go through history, this is, of course, as we've all observed, a very contested right. And there have been many battles in American history. 7 years after the First Amendment, you had the Sedition Act of 1798, and John Adams puts a dozen of his critics in jail. You have the First World War and about 2,000 prosecutions of socialists. You have the Second World War and then McCarthyism to follow. And then you had the Vietnam War. When you progress to the next challenge, which we face today, one of the unique things about it, I think, is that the other crises of speech typically involved a very strong aspect of warfare, and the excuse of attacking speech was because there's a foreign enemy. What's happening today in the attacks on speech really has nothing to do with a foreign enemy. It has nothing to do with a war. The problem for the government is that they disagree with ideas. It's a war against ideas, not against a foreign enemy. And so, in a way, it's a bit different in terms of its origins and perhaps the way that we respond. I'll say just in one more thing. One of the benefits of the Vietnam War controversy was that it generated a lot of cases. So too the civil rights demonstrations that occurred at the same time brought a lot of cases to the Supreme Court, and that's when the Supreme Court started to consider and expand First Amendment rights. And so today, 2026, we have a lot more legal means to challenge what the government is doing when they move against speech. But, and here's a big but, Benjamin Franklin, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, was walking down the street and somebody supposedly asked him, "Dr. Franklin, what kind of government did you create?" He said, "A republic, if you can keep it." If you can keep it reflected the very strong idea that the founders had that the Constitution and the First Amendment is not self-enforcing. It requires what they called public virtue. That is, people would object to government violations of rights. There's no First Amendment army to come over the hill. It requires using the legal system. And one of the problems we have today, and perhaps something we can discuss later, is that too often institutions cave in. Law firms, for example, in America, some law firms made concessions to the president rather than upholding the vow they take to uphold the rule of law. Some major news organizations, in the same way, have made deals to settle cases that everybody in the legal community thinks that they could have won had they litigated. So it does require vigilance, public virtue, to challenge the incursions on freedom of speech and freedom of the press.
Thank you so much for laying out the foundations of the First Amendment and bringing us right from constitutional history back to the present. I would like to give the word to you, Mirjam, for the next input. And we agreed that we start with a very open intro from each panelist. Your view as a historian on the overarching topic of free speech in Jeopardy? Question mark. We still have a question mark.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for your wonderful input and yours, Stephen. And I want to react a little bit to that. And I want to react with a couple of thoughts rather than a statement with a clear sort of message. Because there's so many questions. And, as historians, the question of context is, of course, crucial for us. Without context, there is no history. But also in Germany, I remember discussions in the past couple of years about whether context might be dangerous to history. And it's inherently a problem. If we do not contextualize as historians, we cannot do our job anymore. One of the anecdotes I want to start with, or with one anecdote I want to start, there is an educational program in the US by a private lobby organization which calls itself university, but it isn't. It's called Prager U. Prager U has produced educational videos for some time now, and under the radar for a long time, but they have been used by lots of educators. And they are also in charge of an exhibition very close to the White House now on the history of the American founding fathers. And Prager U has these comic videos, very short kind of like videos about American history. And one of them brings two kids. They're always on a time travel, so they're traveling back into the 18th century and then to the 19th century. And in one conversation, they meet a black educator, and they ask him about his experiences of racism, and he tells them. And then the kids say, "Oh, we're so sorry that you experienced discrimination." And then he says, "Oh, don't be sorry. You are never responsible for the sins of the past." So, being head of an institution here in Munich that was founded only 11 years ago, claiming that we want to take responsibility of the past, a big part of what is being done in Germany still would fall under this rubric of past guilt, and how do we deal with it? And I don't want to say, or I don't want to claim that we do it so much better than anyone else. I think everybody's struggling with a contested past, and Germany has found its way by support of many others. And it's still an ongoing struggle. So when the discussion on monuments started in the US a couple of years ago, and of monuments of the Constitution, yes, yeah. Sorry. So the question was raised: why does Germany not have any Hitler statues in the public sphere? And well, yes, that's thanks to the Allies and thanks to the Potsdam Conference. It was not Germans who decided not to have Hitler statues in the public sphere. That was thanks to the Americans and the Soviets and the French and the British. Otherwise, we probably would have lots of them around. And this kind of transnational context is extremely important. And many things that happened in Germany in terms of reflecting on the past, on past catastrophes, on National Socialism, on the Holocaust, on the Nazi genocides, was because of this transnational discourse, and because many of the survivors who also were part of this transnational discourse would actually ask for it, would claim to be heard, would for decades publish and not be read, and talk about what happened, for example, during book burnings and the story of book, for every content that is published, personally liable for every word that is published within this newspaper. So, of course, the editor of the newspaper was very keen on making sure that nothing against the regime was being published. So that's just, how you do it. And it's strategies that are being used by the radical right-wing parties today, again, by, addressing people personally for what they say, what their institution is doing, for what people related to them say, and they address them kind of like with legal accusations and stuff like that. I was thinking, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in the past years is the question of political neutrality in the sphere of kind of like public education, of public history. This is a big issue because we see more and more teachers in Germany being challenged if they, for example, educate about basic laws in Germany, if they educate about National Socialism, if they educate about many other issues, that they're being challenged, whether they are politically neutral or not. And then there is, of course, the question whether you can be politically neutral in a situation like the one we're experiencing now. And I just want to quote Howard Zinn, who said, "You can't be neutral on a moving train." Yes, we are in a moving train, and it's very difficult to be neutral right now. But it's, of course, one of the things that, that stands in the center of any public education. And one of the most important things for public education or public discourse on history is that you need spaces. You need spaces like this one here. You need the time, like this generous time of 3 days of having these conversations. And this is not something you can take for granted. Germany has, thanks to what happened after 1945, a very elaborated system on historical political education with the Landeszentralen für politische Bildung, the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, many institutions. But these institutions are also, I think, they're not taken for granted anymore, and they're being, like, for example, now in Sachsen, with elections coming ahead, those would be the institutions that are being defunded, that would be defunded right away if the AfD would be in charge. But there is other things that I think that are important apart from spaces, and one is that I think democratic participation needs social equality. I think if social inequality is so deeply ingrained in our societies, like in the US or in Germany, it's very hard to talk about democratic participation because it's, for a lot of people, it's just not possible. They do not have access to the spaces, to the time, to get the audiences they might need. I think this is something we definitely have to keep in mind, that it's really an important aspect. And then, of course, there's the big issue, and when it comes to education, this has become really a big topic, is the question of democracy in the digital space. When the internet was implemented or when the internet was introduced, democratic values seemed to be ingrained in a system which came out of the Cold War and out of a military, and not out of democratic thinking. And we took it for granted. But we never thought about that actually the digital space needs democratic rule. And now we're being challenged with AI and AI systems which are deeply biased, which are anti-feminist, which are inherently racist, which are inherently, by the means of what they're being fed, anti-democratic. We're being challenged with a wave of change, which needs really a quick reaction now. If we're going to make these changes in the next, 10, 15 years, they're not necessary anymore. So I think this is a very important aspect we should keep in mind. And then just a last sentence about the question, and I was thinking of what you said. I really had missed that comment on Michelle Obama. As you said, it didn't spark a big controversy, but it did remind me of 19th century anti-Semitism, which often claimed that Jewish women, especially if they would be emancipated, they were male. They were not women. So they were not part of society as we understand it. So very often I think this anti-democratic changes that we're seeing and experiencing, they're not very creative, but they're recurring to, historical images that we have been encountering over and over and over again. And sometimes they're extremely cynical. I've moved to Indiana with my family in 2014 to teach at Bloomington University, and I think it was a year earlier, it was under Mike Pence, a legal act was passed in the state of Indiana, which was called the Religious Freedom Act. So exactly like the Religious Freedom Act in the original version. But the new version said, this Religious Freedom Act gives you the right as, for example, a business owner, not to serve a customer if this customer is, for example, gay or trans. But it was called the Religious Freedom Act. So it's anything, you know, it's just being cynical. It's using democratic ideas and just twisting them around, just exactly like what we hear when we hear about the conversations of freedom of speech, or what J.D. Vance said when he came to the Munich Security Conference. Our understanding of freedom of speech means that we are free of, and we have the liberty to restrict other people. And so this is something we really have to be we have to be acutely aware of, that there is so many things going on under, you know, and we don't even manage to react to them. So lots of thoughts, and I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mirjam Zadoff. Reymer Klüver, the journalist here on stage, your journalistic angle on the topic of free speech.
Yes, thank you for having me. As a journalist, of course, I'd like to focus a little bit more on this freedom of press part of the First Amendment, and almost as soon as it was written down, there were attempts to limit this freedom of press in the United States by the government, by political movements, by the presidents themselves. Of course, we all remember the many cases about that. And you mentioned the first examples of the Alien Sedition Acts in the end of the 18th century. Were barely 10 years after the First Amendment was adopted, and they made it a crime to publish what the law called false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the government. I think this language is pretty revealing. It tells us how those in power viewed us from the press, not as a democratic necessity, but as something hostile, unruly, even dangerous for them. This tone, I think, from this law sounds pretty revealing even today from what we hear from the current administration. The second example you mentioned, they were the Espionage and Sedition Acts, especially directed against the left-wing newspapers accused of disrupting the government. If this was not what the press is all about, disrupt the and ask for if the proceedings of the governments are really correctly done. There were examples, other examples throughout the American history. You mentioned one briefly, the Pentagon Papers. The affair about the Pentagon Papers was an attempt by the Nixon government to suppress leaked information about the official deception of many governments, presidents before him, about the Vietnam War. And I remember when I was a correspondent in Washington, there was the case of Judith Miller from the New York Times. She went to jail for refusing to cooperate with the government because of government leaks, and the Bush administration really wanted her to reveal her source, which she it was revealed, but she didn't do it by herself. And if you read biographies of modern presidents, which I really like, the pattern the pattern repeats itself. Kennedy hated the press. Nixon hated the press. Bush hated the press. Many presidents despised journalists. So in one sense, there's nothing new what we see now. But that brings me to the real question: what is new now under the current administration? And that's not the hostility towards journalists by Trump and his camarilla. What I think is new is the scale, the coordination, and the method of the infringement of the freedom of press by this administration. In his second inaugural address, Donald Trump said he would, I quote, immediately stop all government censorship and bring back free speech to America. For me, this is a case of Orwellian doublespeak, language that invokes freedom, but it's not really meant to defend the free speech. To be honest, it's really what happened afterwards was it was the start of the campaign to pressure, punish, and intimidate independent journalism, and that is what makes this moment very different from all the different from the attempts to infringe the freedom of press in the past. This is not simply a president being notoriously thin-skinned or vindicative. We have seen that before, Richard Nixon, for example. But this is what is happening now is much more broader, it's much more systematic, and it's much more organized. It is an effort to bring parts of the media into line, especially major broadcasters and news organizations, while sidelining those who are critical of this administration or this new way of thought. Just let me remind you of a few examples. The Associated Press faced restrictions after it refused to adopt Trump's renaming of the Gulf of Mexico into the Gulf of America. That may sound a little bit petty, but it's highly symbolic. It really matters. Once access to information depends on political obedience, journalism cannot be longer independent. Same thing happened at the Pentagon. Established outlets were pushed outside of the building, while friendlier organizations were allowed to stay. That's not a neutral media policy. It's favoritism based on loyalty. And then there were the lawsuits. I think you mentioned them. Trump has sued major news organizations, including BBC, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journals. They were weak lawsuits, of course, but they mattered because they sent a message. They didn't cripple BBC or the New York Times or Wall Street Journal because they were really meritless, but they sent the message to smaller ones, smaller outlets, that this administration can really hurt you. We can really come after you, and this is the chilling effect, which was I think was intended by those lawsuits. And then the regulations of the public media, electronic media, that's used as a political weapon. Under the FCC chairman, Brendan Carr, major networks have faced numerous investigations. Old rules have been revived in a selective and highly political way. Carr has, for example, has suggested that the ABC's talk show The View, which some of you will know, should be scrutinized as a news show under equal times rules, which is pretty ridiculous. This is completely besides the point, whatever you think about the View. The point was that the regulation is used of being putting pressure on the news organization. The message to the broadcasters was clear: if your coverage is too critical, your licenses, your mergers, your legal safety may suddenly become political questions and may suddenly become under danger. And there were outright efforts to weaken public interest media. For example, the financial pressure on NPR and PBS, the attacks on the government funded international broadcasters as Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, which were basically killed. And of course, you all followed the repeated targeting of the late night talk show hosts, Stephen Colbert and others. And then there's still this quieter form of pressure, and I think it's pretty effective. The pressure on owners. This is not outright censorship, but sometimes it's just enough to make owners of news organizations worry about their business interests and perhaps the other business interests, government contracts, regulation, antitrust, access, whatever. And when that happens, journalistic or editorial independence can be softened without a single law or being passed. Just look at the fate of the Washington Post. It's an obvious example. The Post has basically been neutered in the last year. So it's not open repression. It's just happening step by step, and of course it furthers the self-censorship in a lot of ways. But there's also some sort of harsher conditions going on happening now. The U.S. Press Freedom Tracker found almost 170 assaults on journalists in the United States in the last year, and almost all, 160 of them, were by law enforcement, of course, in Minneapolis and other places. Tim Richardson of the Penn called it probably the most aggressive assault on the press in modern times. America has always known conflict between power and the press. That's really not new. What is new is that this is no longer occasional, no longer one scandal, one lawsuit, one outburst. It's a pattern. Freedom of press is being eroded step by step now. through exclusion, intimidation, lawsuits, regulatory pressure, ownership pressure, even violence. So for me, the key question is not whether politicians have always hated journalists, many have. The key question is whether the hostility towards the press is now becoming a mode of government in the United States, and I think it has. And this is not a problem just for us journalists. Thank you.
Thank you, Reymer Klüver. As you can see, we have a really wide-ranging diversity of perspectives here with many threads that we could pick up. I tried to pick up a few of them and guide the discussion for the first 10-15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions and our digital audience's questions. If you would like to contribute, you can use the digital tool that you have accessible when you stream us, and you, of course, can raise your hands and we will have a microphone come to you. But first, despite your different angles, I think there were some commonalities between the views that you offered, namely that the baseline, of course, no surprise, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and all that comes with it is integral to a functioning democracy, and you all were concerned about the health of that very democracy and the state of freedom of speech in the US particular. And my first quick question would be, where do you see the gravest threat to the freedom of speech? Is it the administration, like you said, Reymer Klüver? Is it maybe a not so vigilant society? Stephen, you indicated that society, the people, have a very important role to play. Is it inherent structures, societal structures of hierarchy, as you would point out in your contribution, Vanessa? So what is the key question? And I want to throw in a thought that maybe diverges from what you've said in your opening remarks. Many would say that there is indeed, or there has been pressure more from the left to limit what can be said, like cancel culture and these sorts of things. And I just want to throw in that as a thought. Is it really only sort of the right end of the political spectrum that currently endangers the freedom to express views in an open, candid way? Or are there also other dynamics at play that we could bring into the discussion? Who would like to kick it off?
I just want to say a few words about, if you look at the book bans, okay? So, yes, books have been challenged also from the side of the left in the past 10, 15 years and even beyond. And questions have been raised. Is, for example, a book like To Kill a Mockingbird the best reading for schools to learn about the American South and inequality, or could we also have writers from a non-white perspective and so on? But if you look at the numbers of the book bans, books that are being challenged or forbidden from the right, you can't even compare. It's just, you know, we never had empty school libraries with challenges from the left. And, you know, apart from, you know, the question of, it always comes to the question of wokeness. It's, so the right to be seen, the right to have a history that is being told, the right to be mentioned, the right to be heard, the right to be, the right to be, the right to be. Why is that threatening everybody else? Why is that threatening a majority? I still don't understand it. I still don't understand how comfortably we could just, you know, sit there and say like, well, it's our right not to be, you know, not to hear other voices, not to tell other stories. If we would have done that in Germany, we would have a very, very different situation today. So, you know, in Germany, there's a lot of interest in American sort of like, or let's say the anti-wokeness discourse has reached Germany. But if we would do that in Germany, it would be a very, very different kind of country, because there would be a lot of stories that would never have been told, and a lot of reflections that would have never happened. it's kind of like the fact that Germany had that experience, on the one hand, is good, but it's not, it's not the key. It's not, you can never stop anywhere. So you always have to, it's a continuous process to have a democratic discourse, which means democratic and inclusive and diverse, and to have people, have their voices been heard. You never reach a point where you can say, yes, we did it, and now we're good. It continues to be an ongoing process, and it's never easy. So like if, in Germany we would claim, oh, we're very humanist because we remember our past sins, and that actually gives us the right to be inhuman today at the European borders. It's very problematic because then we use history as a fig leaf. But if we want that, democratic discourse, we have to live with the complications. Yes, maybe the left has made some mistakes, but I just remember after the 1619 project, there was such an enthusiasm of people saying like, okay, we're gonna tell our histories. Or the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama that came up with this idea of that there is an object that you can take home to your county and you can tell your county's history. And a lot of people were getting into that stories. And then there's right away, there was the 1776 project and it shut it all down. We don't want to hear that. But it was just empowering people.
Yes, please, Stephen.
I think when you bring up the left and the right and book bans, it raises an additional challenge to free speech, because we were talking a lot in the beginning about what the government was doing in America, Trump and administrations in the past. So the First Amendment is explicitly and only a restriction on government interference with speech. It kind of assumes that society supports the free exchange of ideas. And that's somewhat up to question now. Book bans are often initiated not by local governments, but by individuals in the community who go to complain that some book in a library, a public library, or a high school library exposes students to ideas that they shouldn't be absorbing at that point. You can look at college campuses and the pressure from students on both sides, left and right, to cancel speakers, to the extent that not so long ago, we had a major law school in the United States where a United States Court of Appeals judge was shouted down because students didn't agree with a lot of his rulings. So I think in order to have a strong free speech culture, you have to have not only resistance to government incursions on speech, but you have to have a society that is not only willing to listen to contrary ideas to their own, not only willing, but eager to, because there's so much to learn from other people who have ideas different from yours. And I think there's a real question today whether people are really responsive to that. It's a very divided society. I think social media contributes to that, creates, through their algorithms, communities of like-minded people who don't get exposed to contrary viewpoints, a variety of viewpoints. And I think that's also a problem that has grown along with government censorship.
So the vigilant defense of pluralism is actually what you're calling for and demanding for the healthy democracy. Reymer, you were about to add something else, right?
Of course, the free speech is in jeopardy, not in many different ways, and of course, it's not only by the government, but it has a huge effect what the government is this administration is doing to the universities and not only, of course, to the press, but and what this government is doing by the immigration crackdown and singling out persons from abroad who raise their voices. So of course the free speech is I think it's mainly challenged now by this government, but of course not only. I think it's also you mentioned it. It's challenged by different actors in the society and of course in the libraries. It's always in the school libraries. It's in the school boards. Is 1-2 persons who start all that. But I think and that's because the society is so polarized in the United States. I think much more than even still much more than here in Germany. But what I've seen is also a certain fatigue in society to deal with these problems, to deal with the infringements of free speech. This is, of course, only very anecdotal evidence, but I have very good friends from times in Washington D.C. and she was always more liberal, very outspoken in criticizing the Obama administration, the Biden and his administration. And now she only talks about how wonderful it is to attend a wedding in Greece and a birthday party in Tuscany. So there's something happening inside some certain, I think, in some persons in some individuals, they just don't care to talk anymore about those infringements on their personal rights, which they care to talk in the past. But now it's, I don't know if they think it's too dangerous or it's just they're just tired. I don't know.
Vanessa, I'd also like your point of view on what the major problem is for freedom of speech, today. And I'd like to add in like another angle that you brought up in your introductory remarks. You talked about the brutalization of language that we experience in American culture, but I would also say in European democracies, the way we speak about each other in public discourse has significantly changed in the way politicians speak. The rhetoric of a US president, but also other political figures, has changed dramatically. And maybe you can add your thoughts on this. Free speech, it doesn't entail saying whatever you want without any human decency about others.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is... I think it's on. Okay.
Yeah.
And you originally asked, so what's the greatest threat? And my mind went to that democracy, well, what Jürgen Habermas teaches us, right? That democracies only work if we know how to have conversations. And when you just brought up rhetoric, I think it's not only about how we speak, how people in power speak about each other, but at each other. How we in our society have to maybe relearn or to re-understand how important dialogue is, how important it is to be respectful to one another, to share honest opinions. So, because I think the whole idea of having the freedom to speak is also understanding that not everybody has equal opportunities, and it's only that now when things are being encroached that we're looking toward that more, right? And then, so maybe a final thought was that if we don't understand enough about how public opinions are being manipulated at the moment, then I think conversations are no longer driven by arguments, right, and reason, but by fear and by manipulation or propaganda. That would be my 2 cents.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions and would like to throw in your thoughts, please raise your hands. I see a first contribution from the audience. We have a microphone coming to you. Thank you.
Hello, and first, congratulations on a very thought-provoking discussion. The challenge is it's caused me to come up with a lot of other questions, but I have 2. The first one is, as a follow-on to the thing that was discussed just recently, was free speech is often seen as a legal issue, but in reality it's also a social convention. What is it polite to say? What is it responsible to say? As a journalist, there are certain things that a Süddeutsche Zeitung would never publish because it's impolite. Or you've got academics that are afraid of being overly woke, and so to speak. So that's question 1. How have the social conventions around free speech changed over the years? The second question comes to the idea of a message board. Free speech is nice, but if you want to enter yourself into the marketplace of ideas, you have to be able to put it on a message board that people will see. And are there responsibilities or facilities that provide who controls and who owns message boards? And this is not just journalistic message boards, social media, video films, but also who owns the museums and the monuments in society. Thank you.
So how have the social conventions around free speech changed? Who would like to take the first one? Stephen.
Well, I'll go back to what I was saying earlier about the breakdown of discussions between people. I suppose people have always been somewhat reluctant to hear ideas that were contrary to their own, but the whole idea of protecting speech, protecting the press, is to be able to hear those uncomfortable comments, those criticisms. And it's very natural not to want to hear them. It's easy to be a libertarian on freedom of speech, but a tyrant once you're in office. Some of the founders can be described that way, John Adams. So it's tough to have your speech challenged. There's a good example. Robert George, who is a professor at Princeton University, and on the conservative side of the political spectrum, absolutely loves his relationship with Cornel West, who is on the other side. And they get together, they have public discussions, and they both say how much they learn from each other. And by challenging each other, by opening up their minds to other ideas and how it positively affects their own thinking. That kind of example is a very powerful one for civil discourse. Civil discourse, not just discourse. Discourse includes yelling at each other, I guess, and shutting down to some extent ideas you don't like, but civil discourse means listening and learning. And I think the fundamental idea that goes back to the founders and back to the Enlightenment is that the marketplace of ideas is so important because we learn from it. And none of us has a monopoly on wisdom, and we don't also have so much exposure to ideas that we can ever be sure that we're right. That was the Enlightenment idea. And I think in America we added kind of the check on government idea. So maybe encouraging that old idea of the marketplace of ideas as one that ultimately helps all of us.
Thank you. Beautiful thought. But we still have one question on the floor, namely the one about the billboards. Who owns the billboards? Who owns the platforms that spread out your opinions more powerfully than the views of others?
may I still come back to the social conventions of what is published or broadcast? Of course, this administration or the Trump fundamentally changed the public discourse on politics and on government politics, and also changed the way the press is dealing with it. When Trump first came into office, and he told one of his incredible, unbelievable things. For example, the New York Times, I still remember that, politely said there are no facts supporting this statement. Now, if you read what the New York Times writes about when Trump says one of these lunatic statements, the New York Times headline Trump lies about. So this is definitely changed, and this is not only the New York Times. I think it's always for myself. I would have. I don't remember, but I wouldn't have called Trump a liar when he came into office. Now of course I do. I write he's a cheater. He's a liar, and I don't know what else. So of course this way the Trump, the MAGA movement changed politics. It also changed the public discourse, or the discourse in the media on this government, and I think it must not be for the good.
I would like to pick up on the ability to get your voice out, the operationalization of free speech, if you will. There was hope with the advent of the internet that now public communication would become democratized, because everybody can be a sender of information, everybody can contribute, everybody can articulate themselves. But the opposite seemed to be the case, because we are drowning in a flood of false information, disinformation, misinformation, and the rhetoric, the tone of conversations has deteriorated as well. Is there a clear connex between social media and the problems of free speech that we are encountering today, that it might make things more democratic in a way, but also less qualitatively, that our conversations become raw and maybe brutalized in a sense?
I mean, I think we didn't change the structures, we just changed the space. And why would we expect that to be any different? Yeah, so it's just translating into another much less checked and regulated space. And I think it's a really important point that we need to be very vigilant to make sure that that space of the internet or social media is regulated very soon, so that we can,
Because it's not part of the regular regulation still, so that's a problem. But I think the logic of social media, and that's a little bit the problem, is that whether it's kind of like it's about I like something or I don't like it. I don't have to say something about it, so it's always a black and white thing. So I'm on either side, and this logic of having a position has really changed every discourse we're having. We're not talking about any content anymore. We're just positioning ourselves. Are you for or against? Are you pro or against? But we're not having any conversations anymore. And this is really sometimes, it's kind of like, it's a logic of war. It's a logic of fight, of constant fight. And this is part of the problem. And I think, one of the things is really, because you also asked about the billboards and who's really kind of like, who has the stage and who speaks. As you just said about the book bans, if you follow the analysis by PEN America, most of the book bans now are not coming out of individual voices, but out of lobby organizations that operate cross-country everywhere and that are going into the school boards. And I always keep remembering an article in the New Yorker some 30 years ago that said, like, I don't know, liberals and leftists don't believe in conspiracy theories. Yeah, that's in part sometimes our problem, that we find it hard to believe that sometimes things are structural issues. And they don't just happen because people are so unhappy about the Bible being I don't know what, or about trans rights, or about Margaret Atwood talking too much about sex, or I don't know. I don't think that this is really what people are concerned about. People are concerned about the fact that they can't afford groceries anymore. And this is just a total shift, that we do not listen to that anymore. But I want to very, very quickly jump to the question of the museums, because there was a study by the Institute for Museum Research here in Germany, and they actually found, well, it was in the interest of what they're doing, that people still are, they trust in museums more than they trust the media and politicians. I don't know if this really is the case, but I think it's connected to the fact that museums are trying to not overwhelm people, to create spaces where they can have conversations, also spaces that are not only digital spaces, but spaces where you meet people, you encounter in dialogue, you learn about other stories, about other histories. I think that people are looking for that kind of moderate tone that does challenge you, present you with something new, but not entirely overwhelm you constantly. And I think this is something that museums have this quality, but the question is, of course, also again, how free are they, and how much is being tempered with their freedom on either side of the Atlantic, and how politically engaged they can be. I remember having conversations with American museum colleagues, who were surprised that we would, in an exhibition, openly criticize an acting politician, because this is something they would never do in American museums that are governmentally funded by the government. But we see that as a problem now in Germany too, that this has been, the question of how free can the arts be, and how critical should the arts be, and how much should they be regulated. I think the most important thing is that we have spaces where we can talk about exactly that.
We currently don't have questions from the digital audience. If you'd like to contribute here, I see a hand. I'd like to add one little question here, and then we go to the two of you in the audience. And then we have to wrap up, I'm afraid, because time flies. You just made the point about the need for regulation and the transatlantic angle, and I want to bring that in, because there seems to be a real disconnect between Europeans and Americans about how to regulate the digital space and how to safeguard freedom of speech while still cutting back on some of the excess that we see in the digital realm. Is the problem that we in Germany have Meinungsfreiheit, freedom of opinion, and in the US you have like freedom of speech, which is conceptualized even broader, that you are free to say whatever you want in the harshest tone you would like? Or is there another problem behind the transatlantic disconnect on the need of regulation?
Yeah, I think under the First Amendment, it goes to a ban on generally on government regulation. And so we all understand that the editors of the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal have editorial freedom to make decisions about what they're going to put up in their papers and on sites. Attempts to regulate social media sites were struck down by the Supreme Court just a few years ago on the same basis, that the owners of social media sites are like the New York Times in that they have their own First Amendment rights to put up or take down what they want, and it's not up to the government to tell them what can and can't be posted. So I think that's sort of a different sort of free speech philosophy that we have on the First Amendment that perhaps conflicts with some European countries, how it's done here.
Thank you. So we have 2 questions from the audience. If we have a third, yes, another one, and we'll take that round together and then bring it back to the panel for concluding wrap-up comments. Please.
Yeah, I just wonder, the image that we've been presented on this panel is maybe a bit convenient history of, or sort of where the threats come from. In my mind, there's no doubt that the Trump administration has launched the most serious attack on free speech probably since the second Red Scare. But there's also a sort of saying, oh, no, there was no problem with cancel culture or wokeism. It was only about sort of saying, when in fact there have been, and this is well documented, lots of cancellation attempts by people from the left. Another thing is, you mentioned critical theory. A lot of people in the critical theory space, especially legal scholars, argued for restrictions on free speech, argued explicitly that saying that the First Amendment was essentially being weaponized against minorities and so on. But the First Amendment and those doctrines that many critical legal scholars were saying was a defense of power are now are the shield against the overreach of the Trump administration. So does that give pause for thought, amongst critical legal scholars actually saying, well, it's important to have the American conception of saying you can't punish particular viewpoints, for instance. A good example is the case called Vulo versus NRA. This was a case that was brought by the ACLU to defend the National Rifle Association, a conservative organization, and the Supreme Court said you can't punish someone on the basis of viewpoint. That has been used to defend law firms, universities, and many of the others that are on the receiving end of sort of punitive actions from the Trump administration. And the last one is to the journalist. You say you call Trump a liar. Would you feel comfortable doing the same thing about the German chancellor, which, given that you have insult laws in this country that specifically protect politicians and can lead to convictions of people who say things about politicians?
Thank you very much. And we quickly move over to the lady in the second row, here to my left. And then the last question in the back. Yes. And please, quick questions, quick answers, so that we can have the coffee break.
Keep it real quick. It's more a remark, and it ties into what Mirjam Zadoff just said. I just want to remind you that in Germany, we right now have a couple of organizations that offer forums where you can meet online, actually, with a lot of people, like 100 or more people. And you speak openly about all kinds of kind of issues, like something like the Stadtbild debate that we've had a couple of weeks ago here. And the format is that you just listen, you don't interrupt, you don't comment. The Anne Frank Stiftung actually has a similar format, which is what I want to say. It's not just happening in the museum, it's actually also happening elsewhere. And I think it's growing also, this kind of movement where you learn to also listen to different opinions, which actually is really a training in democratic behavior. Because I think we often enter into discussions with having an opinion already, and you don't really listen. And then, which is actually what I really also liked about your performance lecture, where you also kind of staged a particular type of, conversation, which had tension in it, but it also had a lot of listening. And I really like that. And this, I think, has to go on.
Thank you very much. And the final question. And if I could ask you on the stage to be very brief in the final remark, pick and choose, 60 seconds each, that would be terrific. And then we continue the discussion, the lively discussion, over coffee and in the coffee break.
Hi, thank you so much. I want to ask about the next generation of free speech in capitalism, essentially. I'm a PhD student in American history, and people have been telling me I will never get a job for years and years on end. What about who funds what we do, and that we can't quantify what we do in an age of capitalism where everything has a number? And I just want to, because shortly mentioned Taylor Swift and the importance of her work. The quote, "Tell me something awful, like you are a poet stuck inside the body of a finance guy." Just want to leave you with that.
Thank you very much. Reymer, I would like to start with you. You were addressed specifically in the first question.
Yes, about calling Trump a liar and implicitly not calling the German Chancellor a liar. I don't want to come to the common line that all politicians are liars in some way or others. That might be a little bit too easy. I think, speaking of the US president, he is a very pragmatic very pragmatic way to tell the truth. What he says today, he says tomorrow, "I didn't say that." And I think what I want, and he says what he wanted yesterday, I don't want it today. So I think there's a really categorical difference between the political style of the U.S. president and the style of any European head of state or head of government, and I think this cannot be denied by coming back to saying that all politicians are in some way lying and not telling the truth.
Thank you. Stephen?
The summary?
Your final thoughts for this first panel? Maybe picking up on the theme again that there might be a blind spot in our debate about where comes the danger for free speech from?
I think it's important when we look at controversies today, especially in the United States, to keep in mind a First Amendment principle that governs a lot of these controversies, which in law we call viewpoint discrimination. And that's the Supreme Court talks about this over and over again, that the government is not permitted under the First Amendment to favor or disfavor any viewpoint. It has to stay neutral in a marketplace of ideas. And so when you go through this long list that you gave us of Trump's actions, virtually every one of them can be categorized as viewpoint discrimination. He disagrees with the Smithsonian. He disagrees with ABC and CBS and the Washington Post. He disagrees with, just go down your list. It's on the basis of a disagreement with ideas that are expressed. And all those things are on their face violations of the First Amendment, because the first principle is the government can't favor or disfavor viewpoints. And that's how a lot of the courts are deciding these cases when they come up, and why some of these powerful institutions that are being sued need to resist the attacks, because the First Amendment since the 1960s in America has been developed with all very extensive protections, including protections against government viewpoint discrimination. Very powerful instrument, but it has to be used.
Thank you. Mirjam, final thoughts on our panel?
Okay, I'll be very brief. So I think one of the big dangers, as you were referring to the dangers again, is really self-censorship that I see with more and more people, that people are afraid of speaking their mind. And that is connected to what you just said, the question of we're living in a capital, like in an age of capitalism that is more and more, less and less social, providing social welfare or equal opportunities, but is just enlarging the divide between those who have access to means also for the freedom of speaking their mind and those who don't. And this will just get worse and worse, especially with AI and the change of the market and the workforce. And so one of the things I want to bring up, and this is something that I think we really have to fight for, and this is the freedom to still believe in change. Because this is something that is really dwindling, and there is kind of like this dark cloud over our heads, that there is no freedom of speech, that there is no access to any opportunities to change things, that there is very few people who have basically more money than most of the states we're talking about. I don't know. There's
I don't mean to be impolite.
I know.
But we have to move on to the last.
I know. So I think, and I'm referring to Rebecca Solnit, who says like, okay, the beginning comes after the end. So we have to believe that change is possible, even if the means seem to be not in our hands anymore.
Thank you, Vanessa. You kicked us off. You wrap it up.
I actually think Mirjam had the perfect final word, so I don't know how to better that. Maybe just a thought on practicing conversations and listening. That this, just because, and maybe this idea of being not confrontational. So if you're arguing with someone who's not going to be factual, there's no point in engaging in a conversation with this person, right? And to say conversations, it's not just black and white. There are not just two positions, but I find extreme or fascist, extreme right-wing positions will always get you into that position. Are you on this side or are you on that side? But if you disengage and if you say, I'm not having that conversation with you, if you're talking this way, I think that practicing how to listen, how to reason, to build up your arguments, and I think that's why working in your field is really important. You need to practice that so you can teach it also, and you can live it. And I think that's, maybe that's also why I think critical thought in that way. Critical thought allows us to do that, to be more nuanced. It's not just yes or no, because the world isn't, right?
Thank you so much. Please, a warm round of applause. Thank you to all four panelists, and now please enjoy the coffee break. Or maybe some quick announcements from Karsten?
Yeah, just a reminder, we were trying to be back at 3 o'clock after all, even though we've overextended a little bit, right? In order to stay in the time slot. Thank you.